Alex. I'm going to put Alex up on the board here. Hello, Alex. I sorry to keep you waiting. And I believe Roricky is back. Look at Roricky. It's been a while.
It's been a while, David. It's been a while.
You look great. Roricky Hutchinson runs Weekly Marks. He teaches Capital 1 and 2, and he does it on Twitter with Professor Adnan Hussein, and he also has a study group. I believe it's done through office hours, right?
Yeah, pretty much. We meet on Sundays, and also we've got a midweek marks group with Sarah Bush and Professor Pamela and Kelly running it. So
Right.
we're growing.
Yes. And my daughter goes to it sometimes. I'm trying to get my son. He's read 1 and 2. Anyway, you're a very valuable member of the community, and it's good to see you again. I know you were doing some stuff, and we couldn't have you on the show for a while. You come to us from London. Who is your guest?
Today I'm really quite excited. We've got someone who I think has written one of the books everyone in our community should have read or have a copy of. So I've got Professor Alex Vitale from uh, Brooklyn College. He's written some amazing work on the police system in the Western world, in the capitalist world, and I've sort of been following Alex's work over the last year, and it's just amazing. It's one of these documents which actually not only spells out what kind of a system we have and why we have it, but also highlights the key points of the policing system and how to actually deal with it. So it's a how-to book, which is absolutely fantastic, and it's all based on research, which is so important. So, Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rodriguez. Nice introduction. I should just let you keep talking.
Don't let me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're really over the moon to have you here, but unfortunately, our time is short. So it's for us. I obviously
just so you know, we're going to do the full half hour. We're just going to be 10 minutes behind,
Okay.
as long as the
So,
professor wants to stay.
That's great.
Yeah, sorry to keep you waiting. Sometimes I can't keep my
oh, no,
mouth. So
well, I think that's David's way of saying, Alex, that one, you got the full half an hour, but we'd love to have you here every month because I think your work is something that's vital for us to share with the world. And I'll give you a bit of a background into our little community that David's built. We're actually a very we have quite a solid Marxist group, which I'm part of, I guess. But actually, the majority of the people who will be listening to you on the podcast or on YouTube will probably be what you would classify as a classic liberal, well-meaning sort of group. So I think your work is really targeted to that person to actually explain who and what our carceral system is, whether you're in Britain or in the US, and also our policing system. And I think what I read the new edition, which you're releasing shortly with Verso Books, I believe, and it was just fantastic. It was great to reread the book. But what it did is it made me ask, well, inside half an hour, what would I like our audience to actually understand about what you've written? And what I realized was there's no point us trying to tell them everything that you've written in these 300 odd pages. It's actually just important to really give them a taste of why they need to have it and to get them excited about getting that book into their e-library or a hard copy. So I thought rather than try and ask you everything that I want to ask you, I wanted you to sort of give that sort of summation of the work that you've done and why you started doing it, and actually what your average good American liberal can learn from the work that you've done. So I'm going to let you start, and where you finish is up to you.
Great. Okay. I'll leave time for a little bit of a follow-up then. So again, thanks for having me. And I also work in the UK. I have a visiting professorship at London South Bank University, and have been involved in a lot of stuff in the UK as well. Though the book is primarily US focused, I think it has a lot of analogies that are applicable around the world. And the book's now been published in Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, Korean. So it's obviously struck a nerve around the world. Okay, so after the police killing of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice back about 7 years ago, we were told that policing was going to get fixed. They were going to reform policing. Obama created this task force on 21st century policing filled with all these professional police reformers and police leaders. And they said, well, if we just give the police more money for training, more money for body cameras, we will become a more professional, less biased, more procedurally proper institution, and that'll fix the problem. Well, the officers involved in the killing of George Floyd had implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras, were operating under a new, more restrictive use of force policy, were operating on a bystander policy that said that officers had to intervene if they saw misconduct by a fellow officer, a new early warning system they had all the training, all the technology, all the new oversight procedures, all the new policies, and it just made no difference. And this is because those reforms just radically misunderstand the nature of the problem. They imagine that if we just make police more professional, that they will enforce the law in a proper manner and everyone will be so happy about letting the police do what the police do. But the deeper problem is that the police are enforcing a legal order that doesn't actually benefit everyone equally. And the most obvious example of this is the war on drugs. We've been waging this war on drugs for 40, 50 years. No lives have been saved. No one has been prevented from getting drugs. No advancements in public health have been made. And that's because the war on drugs had nothing to do with public health or public safety. It was all a rancid politics of race designed to appeal to historically white voters in the Democratic Party and get them to switch over to the Republicans. This was Nixon's, Southern strategy. And his own advisors were like, well, we're for legalization, we're for harm reduction, and have since come forward and said they were in the meetings in the White House where Nixon said, this is all about how do we go after Black people without appearing to go after Black people so that people will abandon the Democrats who signed, civil rights legislation. So the solution to these horrible racial disparities in the war on drugs is not to give narcotics units implicit bias training. This is ridiculous. We need to end the war on drugs. Simple as that. Voters in Oregon last November took a big step in that direction. They voted to decriminalize low-level amounts of all drugs, heroin, cocaine, everything, and turn it over to public health authorities. They're following the lead of Portugal and some other places that have decided police don't have a productive role to play in managing this problem. And it turns out the same thing is true for sex work. We don't need police in our schools. We should not be sending police on mental health calls. We should not be using the police to manage what are social and economic problems created by a political class that is trying to paper over their economic failures by the mobilization of policing and mass incarceration. And for each of these problems, we have concrete interventions that we could rely on instead of policing. We could bring back counselors and high quality extracurricular programs to schools. We can create community-based anti-violence initiatives. We can create non-police mental health crisis response teams. We can rebuild some kind of community-based mental health structure. etc. So the punchline of the book is we don't need nicer, more professional police. We need alternatives to policing.
Yeah, I found that something quite amazing in your border force, border policing part. I was shocked. $23 billion spent on border police. You have more border police than any other type of federal police in the country, in your country. I mean, I live in another country, of course, but I'm just shocked. I'm thinking, $23 billion, you could do a lot to helping people get across the border, be, taken into well-paying jobs and be self-sufficient. Your immigrants
We
tend
could
to pay more tax.
also help rebuild their home countries so that they don't feel the need to come here, because most people want to stay where they are. They're fleeing really desperate circumstances that our own government generally has helped create.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many facets to the way that industrial process of policing is formed and structured. And then the other side of it too is that there's a liberal conception that the police are here to defend the well-being of the citizenry, when actually your work, which the great thing about it is many people question, what Tucker Carlson says or what some other talking head says, which is it's a talking point that's given by a certain biased group. But your key messaging is all based on very solid research. It's got that historical materialist background, which is the core thing. And I would love you just to explain the I think it's an American audience, so the American existence, whether it's from Charlotte or New Orleans or Charleston, sorry.
Yeah, I should just add that I read volume 2 with David Harvey, and
Nice.
volume 3 with Stanley Aronowitz. So I had some good instructors on the.
You might be getting invited to come and do a guest lecture at Weekly Marks, Alex. Careful.
Okay, so the history of policing. So we should first keep in mind that policing is a fairly new institution. The vast majority of police forces are less than 200 years old, most more like 150 years old. The oldest are only about 200 years old. And we have this kind of liberal myth making that policing was created to enforce the law in a way that would create this kind of level playing field that would benefit everyone equally. And this is a classic liberal erasure of the ways in which these legal institutions and legal frameworks are actually created to enable and facilitate regimes of profound exploitation. So policing, which is created in the late 18th and early 19th century, is created in direct relationship to the three primary systems of economic exploitation that were present during that period. And those are colonialism, slavery, and mass industrialization. And so when we look at the origins of American policing, we see them in direct relationship to these three forms of exploitation. In the US South, police forces developed modern, uniformed, professional law enforcement institutions are developed to manage slavery. Not so much this idea of slave patrols in the rural countryside, but actually in the big cities where slaves work outside the home of their owners. They travel across the city to work on wharves, in warehouses, etc., earning wages that are returned to their owners. So in the big urban cities like Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, there are generally more mobile slaves moving around the city than there are white people. And policing is created to manage that mobile slave population for fear of uprisings, revolts, violence, but also to prevent them from congregating, from forming underground reading groups and things like that, which of course slaves did try to do, and they did try to stage uprisings. And so police in the South are enforcing the law, but it's the law of slavery. It's a fundamentally unjust law. In the Southwest, policing emerges in relationship to colonialism, the extermination and forced removal first of indigenous populations by groups like the Texas Rangers, and then the removal and suppression of the historic Mexican and Spanish landholders to make way for white settlement. So they literally pushed these homeowners across the border back into Mexico through raids and false arrests and threats of violence. And in places like South Texas, there was a system of Juan Crow, very much like Jim Crow, up until the 1960s and 70s, where Latinos were denied the right to register to vote or to vote, could not go to desegregated schools. There were separate bathrooms and everything else. And groups like the Texas Rangers were responsible for enforcing that. In the North, policing emerges to manage the influx of European immigrants joining the industrial economy. In this way, very similar to the creation of police in London, who are managing the influx of rural British populations who are dispossessed by the enclosures movement that privatizes their public land holdings that they survived on. So police in New York, Boston, Chicago, et cetera, they're tasked with turning this massive immigrant population into a stable, functional working class by suppressing unionization, suppressing riots, but also micromanaging the public behavior of these groups to mold them into a stable working class. So all kinds of restrictions on public drunkenness, even restrictions on what kind of clothing people could wear. And we see this kind of culminate in the prohibition movement against alcohol, which was an effort to suppress the political development of this new immigrant working class. So again, enforcing laws that have nothing to do with real public safety, that don't benefit the people who are subjected to them, and yet the police are enforcing the law.
Yeah, and you know, it's really interesting because the creation of laws to create those segregations and misogyny and all that type of thing, it goes to the basics of the war on drugs. You know, I saw one of the interviews you did of it, and you talked about amphetamines and marijuana and heroin, and the racialization of each of those at various times. You know, from the Chinese opium in the 1880s through to marijuana in the one Crow type era. You know, it's phenomenal how much of these things are actually integrated into the structure of policing as an oppressive force as opposed to a protective force. And then one thing that I really think is really important from a liberal perspective is to understand the types of negative impacts that it has, particularly when you're talking about criminalizing homelessness and your failures of policing sex work, because that's something which creates underclasses and actually forces people to go underground and be unsafe, as you know, physically unsafe, and you know, in a health respect, be unsafe. So tell us a little bit about that. You know, I mean,
Sure.
Once again, this is about giving you as much opportunity to speak. So go to town.
Yeah, so we've imagined that sex work can be controlled by turning it over to the police, and that somehow this will magically make the lives of women better. And so what we're caught up in right now is what we often refer to as a kind of carceral feminism. So the idea that the way we improve the lives of women is by mobilizing the criminal legal system to protect them. But that system was actually created to subjugate women. in many important ways, and it has never really served that function. The suppression of prostitution in practice and other kinds of sex work is about moral crusades, moral panics, and the micromanagement of the poorest, most vulnerable populations in our society. So there's never any enforcement against really high-end sex work. Their widespread utilization of sex workers on Wall Street, there are no raids happening there. Everyone understands, oh, that's not harming you. But poor people trying to make money to survive on street corners are the targets of this. And the problem, the overwhelming problem with criminalization is that, just like with prohibition, is that it creates an underground criminal controlled black market in which people are more likely to be victimized either financially or through violence or sexual assaults because they have no recourse. And so the movements of sex workers in general across the world have called for various forms of decriminalization that would allow sex work to come out of the shadows, combined with broader efforts to raise the conditions of women as workers, and in particular, teenagers. Because some of the most vulnerable folks to violence and exploitation are teenagers who've been forced out of their homes by abuse, by rejection of their sexuality or gender appearance, and they find themselves homeless, penniless, and thus often vulnerable to be involved in sex work in ways that are harmful to them. And so if we're serious about improving the conditions for women workers, we need to radically increase the minimum wage. We need to create real infrastructures to support young people who age out of foster care, who are teenage runaways, et cetera. And the moral crusaders who want to criminalize prostitution and other forms of sex work are always absent when it comes to these discussions of real distributive policies that would dramatically increase the living standards of women more broadly. And I'll just end by saying, there was a study done in upstate New York among sex workers that found they had all had other kinds of jobs. They had worked in diners and manufacturing and hotels, and they found that work to be sexually degrading, filled with sexual assaults and harassment, and dramatically lower paying than sex work. And so they preferred sex work, which allowed them more flexibility and higher pay than other kinds of wage work.
Do you mind if I ask a question, Roricky?
Of course, go for it, David.
First, we're talking with Professor Vitale. Am I pronouncing your last name?
Yeah, Vitale.
Vitale, and please buy his book. It's published by Verso. It's called The End of Policing. If it's published by Verso, you need to buy it. The End of Policing. Seriously.
The new edition will be out I think December 7th, but you can pre-order it now.
It's a great gift. The holidays are upon us. I can't think of a better gift than The End of Policing by Professor Alex Vitale, and I do hope you'll come back. And thank you, Ricky Hutchinson from London. You are a national treasure here in the United States. You make me proud to be an American. I don't know. We're waiting on Professor Ben Burgess, who I don't know if you know Professor Ben Burgess. You should be on his show. So this is his slot. So I'll book you. Show because you would enjoy being on this show while we're waiting for Professor Ben Burgess. To me, and I think you would probably agree, that the police are an extension of the military-industrial complex. They're funded by fear, just ginning up non-existent threats to American people. As long as we're scared, we're going to pay $1 trillion each year to the military-industrial complex, and we're not going to defund the police. Even after last year, we're reluctant to defund the police. When it became incontrovertible last summer that we have a problem with the police and need to rethink the police in this country, when even the crypto fascists on the right were saying, yes, this looks bad. We need to reevaluate. I said, watch the crime statistics. Suddenly, murder's going to go up, crime is going to go up, and sure enough, the same way the sun comes up in the morning, the crime rate went up in New York City. And all I read about are people being pushed into the subways and how dangerous it is out there. Did it get more dangerous?
Well, let's separate the actual amount of.
I hate to interrupt you, but one second. Professor Ben Burgess is the host of Give Them an Argument. And I just wanted to introduce Professor Alex Vitale and Ricky Hutchinson to Professor Ben Burgess, the host of Give Them an Argument. And I think I have your next guest on Give Them an Argument, Professor Burgess. He's the author. Alex Vitale is the author of The End of Policing, published by Verso. So I think we have your next guest.
Sounds good.
Okay. Bye, Professor Burgess.
No.
Professor Burgess is a columnist for Jacobin, and he is and
Yes, I'm familiar with some of his work there.
Yes.
I am a subscriber
Yeah.
and an occasional contributor to Jacobin as well. I've written a few pieces over the years. Okay, so look, we need to separate out.
Did crime? Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to have you come back. I'd like you to go on Professor Ben Burgess's show. I'd like my listeners to go buy The End of Policing right now. It's published by Verso Books. Let me just quick answer to my question.
Yeah.
We're told that crime has gone up in the past year. It looks very suspicious to me that is happening while people are talking about defunding the police. Are those statistics, can they be trusted?
Well, so we need to separate out the actual amount of crime and the discourse around crime. So the discourse around crime exploded in exactly the way you described. The amount of crime actually decreased. However, there was and has been an important increase in homicides. But interestingly, no other crime, all other crime has fallen. But homicides did go up, and in some places quite a bit. And homicide's a very reliable crime statistic as crime statistics go. So we have a problem. It's not surprising. The pandemic was an incredible stressor on people, and I'm sure is a direct contributor to this. And now that the pandemic has waned, the numbers are coming back down, which is great news.
So it's not a secular increase in homicide. It's tied to people being on top of one another.
And losing their jobs and being afraid of eviction and all the many stresses that people have been under, and the loss of loved ones and all the rest. These are contributing to that, yes.
Right.
And of course, the solution is not to flood the cities with more police. It's to create economic security for people, which we could do, with eviction moratoriums and income supports and all the rest, but also by investing in community-based anti-violence initiatives, which are showing tremendous positive results across the country where they're being tried.
Right. I'm going to, Ricky, I love you, Ricky. My mother and sister love you, Ricky. We've missed you. I'm serious. My mother and sister have been asking, where have you been? So it's great to see you. And thank you for introducing us to Professor Vitale. And I'm glad I was able to introduce you. Let me ask Professor Burgess and Professor Vitale about the New York City subways. When you get on a New York City subway, are you afraid you're going to push somebody into an oncoming? Sorry.
The subways have become much safer as people have returned to the subway. The new statistics look really positive. So this has all been orchestrated politically, all this breathless coverage about crime. And the New York Times has done a bit of a mea culpa. They have had to fall on their sword a little bit because they published some terrible trash about crime and stuff, and they've been taking some steps to correct it, not to let them off the hook, but just to say that the criticism of them has been so withering that they've had to take some corrective action.
In the New York Times defense, they exposed how piggish New York City cops were during the entire George
Yes.
Floyd BLM. I mean, they just had a tsunami of videos of police.
And this was after they had all had de-escalation training and implicit bias training and all that. It just shows how useless that stuff is.
Right. The New York Times is still, what their editorial page is a disgrace. All their columnists, every single one of their columnists are disgraceful, including Paul Krugman, but their reporting is still the best, as is the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. It's their editorial pages that are the problem. Thank you, Professor Alex Vitale. Thank you, Roricki Hutchinson. Really, thank you so much. This is just turning out to be a great show. And the best way to thank the people who put this show together right now is to go online, Verso Books, go to Verso Books and pick up The End of Policing. Go buy The End of Policing right now, because if you buy the book, Professor Vitale and Roricki will come back on the show. They're not coming on because they want to hear me talk. So thank you both.
Thanks so much, David. And thanks, Roricki, for having me on. I hope we get to chat again soon.
Thank you. And I hope
Thanks, guys.
I hope book sales are good enough for you to come back. Go buy The End of Policing right now, Verso Books. Thank you. Thank you, Roricki. Let us